Hi, my name is Nathan Fredericks. I'm a development finance professional at the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa, working as an industry development planner in a unit that's responsible for developing IDC's value chain strategies and then implementing those strategies across the business. My current focus areas is automotive and new energy vehicles, or NEVs, where I develop and coordinate IDC strategies. I also look after areas, for example, in pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and I'm part of the battery value chain team that's currently trying to build out the battery value chain in South Africa. My career at the IDC has spanned over 12 years, where I've started as a business analyst in the metals and transport equipment unit. And then for about a period of about 8 years, I worked in several business units, including forestry and wood products, pharmaceuticals, and chemical products, where I worked as a deal maker and project development manager. Prior to joining the IDC, I worked as a chemical engineer at Mintech in the advanced materials division, specializing in nanomaterials and products such as catalysis, and I worked there for about 4 to 5 years before joining the IDC. So the automotive industry is going through a major transition, similar to the shift that's seen over 100 years ago with the mass production of motor vehicles for middle-income families. This transition involves moving from traditional technologies or internal combustion vehicle technologies to electric vehicles, which also includes, for example, hybrid technologies as well. In 2021, the IDC began developing its automotive value chain strategy to support investments in this sector, which has been driven by various developments in major markets. I think, what is key in this particular, value chain for electric vehicles is there are several key realizations that you need to make in terms of what's happening in this space. The number one thing that we picked up is that there's a need for segmentation, which is very important, including the automotive supply chain, looking at various demand pathways like business to business and business to government markets, the infrastructure and components where the segmentation and pathways meet, and looking at this value chain in a segmented manner allows you to identify the opportunities. China is leading in technology development and production of NEVs with lower cost curves for vehicle production and batteries. The adoption of EVs in China is growing at a staggering pace. I think they're about 55% of vehicle sales and will probably reach 70% in the next 2 years. China is also leading with cost reduction advantages, high capacity utilization across all EV manufacturers. And this is helped by bringing down the cost of EV components such as batteries significantly. The transition for South Africa and the continent will be very different due to, for example, the slower pace of policy development. South Africa's recently released the NEV white paper and released draft amendments to various incentive policies, which may assist the adoption. But the matching of support and matching what has been given or provided in developed countries will be a challenge for South Africa and many developing countries. However, there's some positive shoots that we're seeing with recent announcements by automotive assemblers in South Africa like Ford and BMW, and with BMW also manufacturing its first hybrid plug-in vehicle in South Africa. Developing the NEV value chain is not just about a supply chain, but also about an ecosystem that needs to develop to assist the transition. There needs to be support, for example, to bring the prices for consumers to the same level of parity as existing technology. You need infrastructure investments. There's a lot of consumer education that's required. on the value proposition for NEVs, and you need the involvement of institutions and organizations at the various touch points in the ecosystem. I think the global messaging that EVs are not for us is more about a race for technology and onshoring thereof, and attracting capital allocation to develop markets, which means that it will take time for these investments to come to South Africa or the rest of the continent. And that unfortunately places us in a position where we are followers as opposed to leaders. But there are examples in the past, if you look at South Africa, where, for example, Eskom has had EV programs in the early 70s, 90s. IDC co-funded Project Jewel, where we developed a commercial-ready electric vehicle. So there are some examples where South Africa has led in electric vehicles. The transition will also require substantial financial resources and proactive trade and industrial policy. We see a widening gap between Chinese OEMs and traditional OEMs or legacy OEMs, and we see developed markets in countries implementing aggressive incentive policy, industrial policy, trade policy measures to ensure that there's a relocation of production in their own countries, and obviously this fosters the technology development at a domestic level, but also enhances the human capabilities needed or capacity needed for this transition. In terms of the just energy transition, the IDC has been involved in developing the JET plan since 2021, supporting chapters such as green hydrogen and new energy vehicles. And we've worked closely with the presidency and the JET project development unit in developing these chapters. The IDC was also involved in development of the JET implementation plan and was the drafting partner for the NEV chapter. JET is a way for South Africa to decarbonize our industries, to develop new industries to address wider socioeconomic challenges that we face. The IDC is currently setting up the JET offices for green hydrogen and NEVs, and will coordinate the oversight of plans and its governance structure for the implementation plan. And then I think lastly to add that the IDC is also looking at a more evidence-based approach and strategy to support investments. And subsequent to this, we've actually just concluded a study on electric vehicles, unpacking the value chain linkages for specific use cases, for example, in last mile delivery, logistics, public transport, mining, agriculture, and then looking at what are the associated infrastructure and components that align with this value chain and that could potentially be identified as low-hanging fruit opportunities for investments. And then beyond that, what are the medium-term and long-term opportunities for investments in specific use cases for electric vehicles? The e-mobility movement in the continent is really exciting. And it demonstrates one thing, that it always seems impossible until it's done. There are a few areas where you can highlight where there have been quite a few successes in the continent, and you can see things moving forward. There seems to be a strong desire for governments to transition their transport services to low carbon vehicles. For example, if you look at countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, you're seeing strong evidence of the transition taking place in those countries. These countries want to create economic and employment opportunities in the value chain, creating activities for the people. I mean, that's quite evident. And we're seeing this coming through policies promoting localization and automotive policies. For example, in countries like Kenya, where we're seeing that the government is quite strongly supporting the local manufacturing of electric vehicles in, for example, e-bikes, where it could be used to transition or replace the ice bikes or the boaters that they're currently using, and electric buses for public transport applications. There needs to be a different, slightly different approach to the transition, because the e-mobility solutions have to be tailored to local conditions and the environment. This is particularly true in applications for last mile delivery and public transport. And this gives rise to an SMME ecosystem where entrepreneurs are providing those unique solutions and then scaling them together with support from government finance and green financing. Some of the challenges we're seeing on the continent, for example, are used vehicles, which are quite prohibitive for not just the adoption of e-mobility, but also to establish local manufacturing on the continent. Although used vehicles solve the issue of access to transport and affordability of vehicles, from an industrialization perspective, it creates a lot of limitations. I think the South African example of our automotive supply chain really speaks to what happens when you establish a manufacturing base at what we call a complete knockdown level, or CKD level, which really stimulates beneficiation and value creating industries and creates long-term sustainable jobs. And we see this across the continent, where a lot of countries that have used imports, their local assemblies is limited to semi-knockdown operations. Industrial policies on the continent also need a level of integration with those other countries in Africa. We're seeing a lot of countries adopting similar policies to South Africa, but without the level of integration, all you're creating at the end of the day is policy islands, essentially, which we can try to address through, for example, the Africa Free Trade Agreement or rules of origin. But I believe there's a greater need for partnerships and alignment at a country level to really unlock the regional value chain opportunities and to create a level of integration where we can build a regional industrial base for transport equipment. Funding of large projects will also be critical, and this can only be done through partnerships, I believe, so that we can create the appropriate capital stacks to support projects and enterprises at various stages of development. The battery value chain is an example where in the continent we need to create a regional value chain. We have to build out the midstream for intermediary and high value products. And some of the investments really at the project development level could cost upwards of 10 to 20 million US dollars. And in the implementation or FID stage, these costs can increase by 5x or 10x. The other need is for supporting SMMEs, where they require funding for proof of concept and pilot stage studies to demonstrate services offered, which will essentially assist them to tie up agreements and offtakes with major downstream players. And then we can't emphasize the need for policy integration. Greater localization for EVs on the continent can create long-term sustainable jobs in manufacturing. Higher levels of integration within countries will allow each country to leverage its capabilities. Some countries don't have the deep industrial base, but they do have large markets, and particularly large transport markets, which then creates opportunities for shared prosperity across borders. More support for SMEs and mobility is definitely needed. And there are good examples, not just in Kenya, but also in South Africa, that speaks to these points. I think that the biggest success stories in e-mobility to date is definitely the last mile delivery space, where we're seeing SMEs that have scaled their service offerings through proof of concept and pilot stage projects. And some are even operating fleets, providing servicing for food delivery platforms, for retailers, and for logistics companies. The IDC has invested in 2 companies, for example, Green Riders and Mellow Vans, and both these companies have continued to expand after our investments. For me, in addition to increasing the number of SMEs in the space, the other success is really the employment opportunities that these businesses are creating. For example, Green Riders employs unemployed youth from townships, provides them with training, support, so that they can have jobs in the food delivery space using e-mobility and have and be able to earn a decent income at the end of the day. And for me, that's really the successes we want to see. Some companies are also demonstrating that despite the energy challenges, for example, that we faced in South Africa, and the fear around the lack of energy supply when owning an EV, there are companies that have demonstrated that they are still able to operate EV fleet operations and charge from the grid. So really debunking the myths around the new technology and its application, and providing us, data from putting the assets in practice that shows that we can operate EVs and EV fleets in South Africa despite the challenges we face. So I definitely think there's a strong need to decarbonize supply chains, and there's a drive from that, particularly from private sectors. We see this across the world, where supply chains are pushing towards low carbon emissions, and obviously a large component of that is transportation. There is a strong case for this based on, for example, total cost of ownership and the difference between the existing ICE technology and NEV technology. But this does vary depending on the use case. For example, last mile delivery, it's quite comprehensive, that the total cost of ownership is significant, where long haul logistics, there are a few things that need to happen to make that value proposition more appetizing. But I don't think we can wait for things like economic viability. It's an important consideration, but also, it might come at the expense of developing out the climate resilient supply chain, where there's still a lot of learnings that need to happen. The transition has many stakeholders in supply chains, and they are all different. And they all exist on various nodes of supply chain. But I think what's important is that there's a relationship between the buy side and the supply side of this equation to ensure that to make things happen. I think we all acknowledge the importance of the task at hand, but we can't wait for technology to mature and to match a business case, the same business case as older and more carbon intensive technology. What we also need, I believe, is for more first movers in Africa. It's important to have first movers, and we see this in many other countries as well. On both sides, particularly on the buy side, and that partnership is crucial so that we can actually demonstrate how things can be done, how we can implement projects, technologies, and then share from those learnings. I think there's a bit of unfair expectation of the role of government, and I think the transition government, and then of course the support for the transition through mainly fiscal capital. Unfortunately, the situations in developed countries are different from developing countries, and therefore I believe that through a partnership with private sector funders and government, we can de-risk the adoption of e-mobility and supply chains at a faster pace. I believe that Aegis is an important event. It's one of the events we look forward to in the calendar year. And Aegis, tries to differentiate itself through the conversation it has about the transition, and which is critical for investors, for project promoters and enterprises. And it really brings together all of these stakeholders in the same room, so that they can engage with each other. I think for me, what's very sort of one of the key areas that Aegis touches on is, for example, bringing funders and projects together through, for example, their business matchmaking platform, and that's definitely been a highlight for me over the past 2 years, and I think there's been quite a lot of success around that. I think this year we'd be looking at, for example, a green supply chain segment, where we cannot underestimate, the need for this platform where knowledge is shared across the continent. And hopefully, this segment will showcase successes in decarbonizing logistics from last mile to ports, and then also allow for engagements at different nodes of the supply chain to create opportunities that we can scale. I think Aegis as a platform is having an impact by ensuring that the right conversations are taking place, and that stakeholders can have an impact. Stakeholders can have an impact who are in the room and engaging with each other, and after the event, continuing that engagement. I think Aegis has bring new dimensions to sort of the space of green conferences. For example, the Funders Roundtable at its last event was a very interesting addition to the event, where I believe it was very important to have project promoters in the same room as funders and listen to funders engaging with each other on the need for the transition, the challenges they face, the limitations, and then the desire to support the transition towards a low carbon economy. This exposure is really valuable to project promoters and enterprises or entrepreneurs, so that they can then go back and align their business plans to attract the right type of capital and investors.